stranger to the works of Shakespeare, many times over, of course, throughout your career. When it came to doing the life of Shakespeare, though, I was curious, what drew you to those final 3 years? Because you could have approached this material in a number of ways.
Well, it sort of became clear over the years of working on his plays and finding out a little bit about him that this initial traumatic event, the burning down of that theatre, had a profound impact. He'd been there 20 years, and he was a sharer, he was a producer, he was a writer, he was an actor, and it struck me as interesting that he would decide, well, that's it, and he would go back to his hometown, a town in which he'd sort of left in semi-disgrace, and certainly his father had this, he was the mayor of Stratford, and then was accused of usury, and there was a great falling there was a great disgrace. So to go back to that town, someone who was now very glamorous and celebrity, really, he was the greatest, acknowledged to be the greatest writer of his age, to go back and sort of face up to whatever was the results of having been an absentee father, absentee husband, and to do so while needing to acquire these things. You know, he did spend £20 or about $5,000 on that coat of arms that allowed him to be called gentleman, and it seemed, curious that should, just as Ian McKellen's character says in this, why does it bother you? Why does it matter? And so I guess I wanted also to do what Shakespeare does so many times in historical plays. He takes the facts of a life. So in this case, he did go back to Stratford. The two girls were both involved in sexual scandals. He did leave his wife the second best bed. All of those facts are there, but in between, we were trying to find the man, basically, and we tried to find the man through the plays, just like he would. He didn't know anything about what went on behind closed doors in Julius Caesar's house, but he did know what the dates of his life were, and he filled in the rest of it. So we had all this material about in the plays he writes about twins so often, he writes about the loss of children so often, and particularly at the end of his life he wrote plays about the problems with daughters and the loss of daughters and the desire to reunite a family. So all of that seemed to be wrapped up in those last 3 years somehow.
I was curious, as you talk about all these facts from his life, obviously this is something that is fact-based and somewhat of a fictional elaboration, but how important was it to be authentic, given most viewers probably wouldn't know the difference, to some of the facts that you do render very faithfully here?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, again, starting with this sort of Shakespearean approach, in spirit, we were trying to find the humanity in the man, and so in order to take that license, it felt as though for some people, for instance, it's just they don't want Shakespeare to be interested in having a mortgage. They don't want their geniuses thinking like this. This is sort of post 1800, post the Romantics. Geniuses became people with classical educations who looked like Lord Byron and who were mad, bad, and dangerous to know. They were not men having trouble with their daughters and their wives giving them a legitimate hard time for their behaviour, and wanting to spend £20 on being called a gentleman and being proud of having the second house in Stratford. This is more along the lines of what Flaubert referred to when he said, be bourgeois in your private life and revolutionary in your artistic life. But for some people, that's not how they want their geniuses. They want their geniuses to be colourful and to sort of be more sort of rock and roll. And so that seemed to me one of the beautiful paradoxes of what one felt about the facts of Shakespeare's life. And so much of it seemed to me there are so many parts of the story that feel so universal, but they get set off so we know that he extravagantly dedicated the sonnets and Venus and Adonis, his narrative poem, to the Earl of Southampton. And it's a legitimate speculation, I think, to suggest that the feeling in those poems, which are little plays in themselves, could legitimately lead you to believe that there was a real passionate and genuine and sincere feeling for the object of those poems, in the poems, enough to warrant the idea that a woman who cannot read and write in Stratford, who has heard that this, for non-publication, this privately circulated pamphlet is now for public consumption, and just like we might nowadays, and with most writing, go, well, it's really autobiographical, isn't it? It's really writing about what he knows, isn't he? So we know that he knew the Earl of Southampton. We knew about those dedications. We don't know that Anne gave him that kind of grief, but we do know that he came back to Anne and they were together, and that it seemed to me, Ian, for instance, Ian McKellen talks in a one-man show he used to do. He asks the audience, if they know Shakespeare, he said, can you recommend any marriage in these plays? Is there any successful marriage in Shakespeare? He says, because there isn't. The only successful marriage is the Macbeths. And they kill people. But in fact, I think there are quite a lot of relationships that he definitely presents in feisty form. The Percys in the Henry IV plays, in Benedict and Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing is at least a very sparky sort of union. So I think it's not hard to start saying, well, where did that come from? Let's assume maybe that came from life as well, in which case, and it's William Shakespeare. He married someone who was 9 years older than him, and it's an obvious thing to say. Anne Hathaway must have had something. One can maybe assume she may not have been able to read and write, but I think it's a legitimate assumption to suggest that she ain't stupid. And